Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, good morning. My name is Aurélie Gros. I'm Senior Project Manager and an internal expert on climate-induced migration at ICMPD. It is my pleasure to host this first spotlight session on migration and climate change. Do we find ourselves at a crossroads? And we'll be trying to answer this question. So after the apocalyptic summer that we all experience, I cannot think of a more consequential debate than the one that we're going to have now. There is no question that among the overarching challenges the world is facing, climate change ranks at the very top. And to delve into the issue, I have the very great honor to host Gaia Vince, who just published a book entitled Nomad Century: How to Survive the Climate Upheaval. Gaia is an acclaimed and award-winning science writer and broadcaster, exploring the interplay between the environment and humans. She is also an honorary senior research fellow at the University College London. Gaia, a warm welcome to the VMC.
I'm so pleased to be here talking to you, and in such a beautiful room as well. We're very lucky living in Central Europe here, where things are quite pleasant and we don't have to think so much about climate change yet, exactly where we live. Although, as Honorary said, we are already experiencing the effects. We had this horrendous summer, which may have faded slightly in people's memories, but where temperatures hit above the 40s, all sorts of catastrophes happened. In the UK, where I live, airports were closed, railways didn't work. I had to withdraw my children from school because we're not set up, we're not adapted to that environment. But of course, in large parts of the world, in large regions, people will not be able to adapt to climate change. Within a few decades, they will have to move. Already, climate migration exceeds migration from conflict. Migration from extreme weather disasters is greater. That sort of displacement is greater than the displacement from the big acute crises we've already touched on: Ukraine, Absolutely. Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much already, Gaia, for sharing those facts. And I also would like to set the scene before we get into really the discussion together. And the facts are as compelling as they are clear. As you just mentioned, every minute, 44 persons are displaced because of disasters. That's 4 times more than conflicts. And we must look beyond the humanitarian consequences and anticipate the long-term impacts on societies and communities.
Yes, so climate change is a threat multiplier. So people who already are facing other problems, conflict, poverty, harvest failures for other reasons, climate change is just that extra push that adds to the displacement.
Absolutely. Looking ahead, rough predictions range from 50 to 300 million displaced by climate change by 2050. But let's keep in mind also that human movement is hard to model, so it's also difficult really to predict here. Alongside of plethora of governmental and non-governmental actors, ICMPD is working through policy dialogues and capacity building programs to address those issues on the ground. Only last week, we facilitated a thematic meeting in the context of the Khartoum process in Addis Ababa. Until now, as you said, interventions have mainly focused on dealing with humanitarian consequences and building adaptation capacities. But what if some areas of the world cannot adapt anymore and people cannot live there? And that we barely start to see. So also to quote perhaps Vice President Skinner, we are naked on this topic. So with this spotlight session, the intention is really that we provoke with you outside the box thinking, that we go beyond the conceptual debates and controversy over numbers, and that we think about relocation and migration as an adaptation strategy.
It might help to think to take a planetary perspective on this, because this is really an unprecedented experience for our species. For the last 200,000 years, the world we evolved in was the Pleistocene. It was an ice world. And then just very recently, the time period of the development of agriculture, the development of all our civilizations, our cities. And when we developed agriculture, we created crops that don't exist except under these particular climatic conditions that we created them in. Well, we are leaving that world now. In some parts of the world, we have already left it. So if we take a planetary perspective and we look at our planet according to true borders, and these are not the invented geopolitical borders that we're all very familiar with, but look at the true borders set by climate and geography, they are moving. The zone of human habitability is already moving to different latitudes. We cannot live in large numbers in deserts. We can't live in Antarctica. The places we can live are shifting and shrinking. We need to think about how we are going to keep our species in habitable places, and that will mean movement, but it doesn't have to be a disaster. What we can do is something we're not very good at doing, which is have a vision of the world that we want to experience. Because this climate change is happening, the temperature is going up. We will have exceeded 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, perhaps as soon as 5 years from now, but certainly by the 2030s. That temperature is going to continue to soar, even if we can bring it down by 2100. The world in 2050 will be a very different world, rocked by continual climate disasters like is it being experienced in the west coast of the United States and the east coast of the United States right now, as experienced by Pakistan when 33 million people were displaced very recently. The Philippines, I could go on. There is a list upon list. What we can do is create a vision of a habitable, productive, clean, sustainable world and then make the steps to manage that, to get there. It does require a different way of thinking, a planetary perspective.
Gaia, in your book, you put forward a bold vision to use relocation, and I would say mass relocation of communities from the regions that are affected by climate change in the south towards the global north. Could you please tell us a bit more about this and how to muster the collective will that it would take to take those steps?
Yeah, so it is quite radical. I'm not an extremist in any way. I'm very much not. But this is an unprecedented crisis that we are facing, and it demands an unprecedented response. It really does. So I am proposing that what we do, instead of veering from one disaster, one crisis to another, which is what we have at the moment, instead of repeated conflict and exacerbated conflict, we actually put in place a managed migratory system, because we are talking about large regions of the world with enormous populations, many of whom will have to move somewhere. For some of them, there will be adaptive possibilities, but for many, there will not. You look at Mumbai, it's a city of 22 million people, already inundated regularly. It's on the edge. 7 million of those live in slum housing, concrete boxes with metal roofs. The temperature there is already 6 to 10 degrees hotter than in Mumbai proper. That is not something you can adapt to. You cannot put air conditioning units in all of these little boxes. You would immediately have power outages like you do anyway in the city. So this is not possible. People will have to move. They will have to move from coastlines. They will have to move from low-lying islands. We need to raise our heads and face this honestly, the challenge that we face. We need to actually look at this situation. And then we need to think of how we can manage it, because we can manage it. There is plenty of room. We will have to expand cities, we will have to build new cities, but it is possible while we decarbonize, while we restore the planet's habitability. This is a very, very pressing issue for the next few decades. We can do it. It will take global cooperation. It will start with regional cooperation. So already the way that the EU handled the Ukraine crisis very quickly undoubtedly saved thousands of lives. It is possible. It does take investment. It takes not just investment in housing, in healthcare, in infrastructure, but also investment in society, in making sure that there is true social inclusion, in making sure that we expand the definition of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be part of a nation, that people are truly, their needs are aligned, that they are citizens of progressive, inclusive, productive, economically productive new cities of the coming decades. I would much rather that my children were living in larger, perhaps more crowded, but more inclusive cities with Bangladeshi neighbors, with neighbors from Yemen, than that they were conscripted into an army to fight on the borders of Europe against these enemies. I really hope that during this conference, at the back of your mind, you are thinking about the new world that we are entering, which is not an iteration, which is not a slight adjustment to this world, but is a dramatically altered world. Climate change is everything change, because the climate is the fabric on which we live and build our lives. When that dramatically alters, everything changes. Where we can do our agriculture, where we can live, changes. But we can make this positive. We are facing a demographic crisis in the north. In Japan, adult nappies, diapers outsell baby ones. Everywhere, we need to accept immigration is a solution to the crises we face, but only if we make it work.
And Gaia, how do you convey the urgency of the issue? Because when we look at prediction, we tend to think this is a problem of the future. But are we at a crossroad now, back to the title of the session?
Yeah, so climate migration is now inevitable. The scale is not inevitable. We can change things. We can reduce the scale in various ways. We have many, many choices. But doing nothing is also a choice, and it's not a choice that we should be making. It's an abdication of responsibility, not just to people in our own global community, but for the generations to come. This is an urgent problem, because the decisions we make now, the cities we choose to build, the infrastructure, how we understand where the investments in an expanded city are, these are all decisions that we need to make now for the decades to come. 2050, we could see as many as 1 billion climate-displaced people. They will not all come to Austria, but many of them will need to head north. How much better to handle this in a managed way over these decades than to build up an enormous crisis? The difference between now, the time period between now and 2050 is the same time period between now and when the film The Bodyguard came out. It's not that far. It's not that great a time difference. We don't have very long. And it's not okay to ignore it for 10 years and then suddenly wake up to it. We did that with our decarbonisation effort. And how much more expensive is it now to panic and quickly try and find alternative sources of energy because of the Ukraine war? How much better would it have been if we'd have acted faster and done it much earlier? Well, the same issue is happening with migration. Even if you can't see it, it is happening. It is happening across the Americas. It is happening throughout the continent of Africa, but particularly from some of the worst hit places in East Africa and the Sahel. It's happening, of course, across Asia. At the moment, a lot of it is internal. but increasingly it will be international. We need to help this. We need to rethink our idea of what borders really are. We don't need to remove borders entirely, but we need to recognize that this is an economic issue, and labor is our biggest resource. It's a bigger resource than the food that we trade, than the iron and other commodities we trade. Labor is huge. It's a really, really important part of our economies, and we're not making it work because we're not tackling this, this huge issue.
Thank you for this powerful reflection, Gaia. I will ask you one more question, and then I would like to open the floor for some reactions. Can you think about one of two most important things that governments here can do immediately to better prepare?
Yes, so first of all, we need to realize that we are in the Anthropocene, so we are in a changed environment. And that means that every decision that is made in terms of where infrastructure is built, where housing is built, has to be made with that knowledge that we're experiencing now, not the temperate conditions of Europe or the reliable monsoon conditions of Asia, but we are moving into a time of extremes, extreme heat, flash floods, drought, and everything needs to be built with that. It's also really important to not pussyfoot around, what is a way, not to be tentative around some of these very big divisive issues. There has been, of course, a rise in nationalism and in populist governments that have used anti-migratory, anti-migration, anti-refugee narratives, very toxic narratives, to bolster their own popularity. These are easily disproven through multiple large-scale studies to do with the effect on the economy, the effect on crime rates, all of that. Migration does not increase crime rate, it does not increase unemployment, it does not lower wages, especially when it's managed well. It's an abdication of responsibility for centrist governments, for coalition governments, for left-wing governments not to counter these narratives. Do not be afraid of your citizens. Most of them are not nearly as xenophobic as some of the leaders that we have, and I count my own country in that. Most people are actually very generous and treat other people with respect for their common humanity. It's really important that we do counter that narrative, really important. And that we build truly inclusive societies. It's not okay to segregate refugees and not give them the ability to work, the ability to apply for citizenship, to move across borders. If they cannot help themselves, they will then develop their own separate black market economy just to survive, and that will be in competition with the formal economy. Much better to include people in a joint, aligned project for a progressive, productive society that we all want for ourselves and our children.
Thank you, Gaia. I would like now to open the floor for some reactions. Please introduce yourself and keep your conversation or your comment or question very short. Yes, my colleague Hugo here.
Hello, I'm Hugo Brady from ICMPD. Gaia, you're sitting in a room full of interior officials, explaining to them that they're going to soon have to welcome hundreds of thousands of people into their countries. This is an interesting first session of the Vienna Migration Conference. But I wanted to, your message might be well received by liberal democracies. I wanted to ask how you see a future where we have to convince Russia and China of the multi-diverse, multi-ethnic 100 new cities in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, Russia, for example, is looking forward to having its first warm water ports in history because it will make it a more effective superpower, as it were, or military power. So I remember when your book was reviewed in The Economist, it was contrasted with Anatol Lieven's book, which kind of argued more in this direction, that your message is, despite its starkness, refreshingly positive with its optimism. Lieven says basically, yes, but autocrats are not going to be convinced by a message like this.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. So, take Russia, extremely xenophobic leadership, but actually also quite a xenophobic populace because of this narrative, the success of this narrative. So, on one hand, we have this, and this is true for a lot of populist leaders, on one hand, we have this very anti-migrant, this quite racist, actually, narrative, and with the other hand, welcoming in not just new people from the USSR, Russia's facing one of the most acute shrinking towns, shrinking cities. It's actually in huge trouble. It's now welcoming people from China, from the Chinese Belt and Braces, the road program, so all the way across. They need people, they know that. So even though with one face they're saying one thing, the other one they are pulling people in, they need that. They absolutely need it, and I think it's very interesting what's going to happen to Russia. We don't know, but I think it's very easy to get pulled into these acute, huge catastrophes that are going on politically right now and not take the long-term view, which is that Putin himself is 70 now. You know, he's very sadly not going to be with us for much longer. How is that going to play out? Russia is enormous. The eastern part, is it going to become Manchuria again? We don't know. We don't know. But they are going to be pulling in people, huge numbers of people to there. They also face their own climate issues, huge amounts of drought. But at the same time, they are and melting permafrost, all the devastating problems of climate change, but at the same time, they're also going to benefit from climate change in other ways, as is Scandinavia and the far north, Canada. And that is the reality of however xenophobic the leaders are, actually they do need immigration. Almost all of them, and they are bringing it in, you know? Even Japan that went to the extreme level of granting robots citizenship before accepting immigrants is actually loosening its immigration now because they need people. So what I'm saying is let's have a management in place because the migration crisis that we're facing now, whether it's Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, is tiny compared to what is coming. It really is. And if we're panicking over this and creating all sorts of catastrophes out of something which could be managed, well, we have no hope of dealing with what's coming. So let's really think about how this may be managed. Take away from your head this idea of trickles of people arriving on boats or coming across, whether it's, dragged in really unethically via Belarus or whether it's going across via Libya or whatever. Take that out of your head and imagine, 10 times that, more times that, people coming. And let's think of ways that this can be managed for our benefit, because it's inevitable. It will happen whether we manage it or not. Far better to have a plan in place and a narrative that can be explained and sold so we make a democratic choice about how we manage it, because there are lots of different ways of doing it, but not managing it is not the answer.
Thank you, Gaia. I believe we have another question on this side. Just here on the first row, please. Thank you.
Can you help her with the microphone, please?
Thank you very much for a very interesting debate on climate and migration. What struck me is the fact that you said the disaster-related displacement is 4 times the conflict displacement. That's something we need to discuss more and more. Because we think, and I'm coming from an African country, we think that most of our migration is driven by internal conflicts, internal situations, and economic driven migration. So this is something that you mentioned we need to talk about. I'm sure that you have the statistics that confirm what you said about that, the fact that it's 4 times the conflict-driven migration. But what I want to stop at is when you said migration is a solution for the European countries. Because to accept this fact is difficult for Europe. And I'm somebody who's working in this area for many years. It's not, but for me, I always relate this issue of migration to the pushing factors. Why people migrate and leave their countries, whether because of disasters or because of conflicts of economic reasons. But what I'm looking for in your debate is what are the solutions that can be done by the countries itself, the countries of origin. Mm-hmm. What is their role? Because now we're talking to a European, most of it a European audience, talking about convincing Europe that migration is one of the solutions, demographically and in many ways. But what are about the countries of origin of these migrants? There is push factors in these countries. There is this instability in these countries. Some or part of this disability is caused by some European intervention in these countries politically. And we can have times to debate on what I'm saying.
Thank you.
My question to you is, what about the countries of origin in relation to climate issues? We know that next month in Egypt, we'll have COP27. We'll have all the officials of the world. We'll gather in Sharm el-Sheikh. We'll debate these issues. And part of it will be the issues of migration and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can take another question and then address the two together. There was another one over there. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. Marta Foresti from ODI in London. I want to ask your opinion as a journalist and a writer and somebody who knows about communications. I have a deep worry, and my worry is that having worked on migration for a few years, I think we've made big mistakes in the way we frame some of the narratives about the reality of human mobility. And my worry is, in particular in the lead up to COP, where migration and climate will be a major issue, is that we're going to do even worse, because as the conversation we're having demonstrate, we are at the same time framing this debate as a matter of disasters, of catastrophe, of inevitability. In the next sentence we say, by the way, all that can be easily managed. All we need is global cooperation, which we know is not in big offers. And then we say, and actually the cities that need to decarbonize will need migrants in the workforce. Now, all of these things are, of course, true to some extent, but I really worry that we are creating, in a way, a confusing narrative, or one that is actually very difficult to persuade anyone that we actually have a solution to. And we're going to end up creating more panic around the prospect of invasions and large numbers of people coming, rather than focusing, as you suggest, on shifting to solutions. So from your perspective as a writer and as a journalist, where do we begin to unravel this? And we don't have long, because COP is coming up. And COP is going to be in Africa, so there is a real chance to focus on the real needs of some of the countries of origin, so to speak. But we've got to do something about this framing, because I really worry that it's terribly confusing. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have two questions. The first one was what country of origin can do, and then on the narrative. Yeah.
So countries of origin obviously have a big responsibility to their own citizens as well, and some of them are already taking proactive steps. So Bangladesh is a really good example of this, actually. It's setting up a lot of secondary cities rather than Dhaka to become migrant receivers for people who are displaced, with training programs to help them, to help migrants who may come from agricultural backgrounds to be able to take more jobs in the cities and cities that they then move to as they change. So, so helping with, you know, changing the labour force in terms of skills and training is one important job. Forming dialogues and partnerships with host countries as well. So there are relationships, for example, with hospitals and universities in the Philippines to train people, and some percentage will remain in the Philippines, and some will take jobs then in, say, geriatric care in the United States or in Canada or somewhere. So there is a training relationship so that the new host country gets workers that it needs, and the country of origin also gets training for the people it needs, perhaps in maternal care or something that it needs as well. So these relationships, where it's planned and managed, can be really helpful. In terms of the narrative, just to be clear, I never said any of this is easy. These are the biggest challenges that we will face as a species, as a community. Huge people moving. I don't think migration is bad at all. Who among us here lives in the same house that they were born in? Does anybody live in the house that they were born in still? Nobody. Does anybody's parents live in the house that they were born in? Maybe one, two? Yeah. Migration is completely normal. It doesn't make you a bad person. I think we need to migrate more. But the idea that large numbers of people have to leave their homelands because of an environmental disaster is nothing short of a tragedy. This is not anything that we should be celebrating. It's horrendous, it's awful, but it's happening anyway. How are we going to manage it? If we manage it, it will be less awful. That's what I'm saying. We can stop making this a continual catastrophe. We can we can make it an agreed, partnership-led, you know, where there is hope, where there is a future for our young people, from all these, you know, young people who are facing hopeless situations in the global south.
Thank you, Gaia. We have two more questions, one in the back and one over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Carolina Lassen from the Council of Europe, and I'd like to really congratulate ICMPD for this really good initial of the conference. And I think we just witnessed a huge gap between the first session with the men in grey and the second session with a completely different message, with a completely different philosophy, and this is really an example of what our societies are living. So I just wanted to raise two issues. First of all, a very difficult question, because we are here in the session of the difficult questions. How do we bridge this gap between the planetary problem, the difficulty of the issues, the need for global and regional cooperation, when we have very short-term, very political governments, very populistic governments and leaders dealing with short-term voters in our member states where the narrative of populism has won. I mean, let's look at Sweden. I mean, left and right have the same policy.
Let's look just briefly at Sweden. Very generous very generous refugee acceptance policy. But did true inclusion happen? No, it didn't. There's silos, there's segregation. Not enough work went into that. We need to learn the lesson from that it's not just enough to make people physically safe in a new environment. They have to be socially safe as well. And it does take work, it does take investment in time and energy, and not enough of that has occurred at all. We are facing planetary tipping points, extreme planetary events, ice sheets melting, coral reefs dying, the Atlantic currents that drive the Gulf Stream. These are all tipping points which we could exceed in the next few decades. That would be catastrophic. We need to do everything we can about the physics of this situation. You cannot argue with physics. Social tipping points, on the other hand, can be much more quickly modified. We've all seen that. I would not have believed the EU's response to the crisis in Ukraine from one day to the next to say, come in, you can work, you can move around the block, you will be assisted. I would not have believed that would happen. I would have thought there would be months, if not years, of negotiations about exactly what, that saved lives. We see tipping points all the time socially. We can do it, but it takes investment in changing that there has not been a strong counter-narrative led by parties. There is this timidity of parties who believe the narrative of perhaps these populist leaders.
Sorry, yes, my second point is because I have to sell my product.
Very quickly, please.
It's the human rights debate. We haven't heard it yet, and we have a European policy going really more in terms of clash with human rights legal obligations our member states currently have. So I just wanted to really throw this because I will be missing tomorrow morning's session on Europe, and I think we have to bring the human rights of the European citizens and of everybody coming under the jurisdiction and all the trouble we have now in the European Court of Human Rights and beyond in our continent. So just to throw the human rights element which has been missing so far. Thank you.
Hold on, we have one more question over there, and then we're going to wrap the session.
Thank you so much. I'm Ambassador James Kur Morwell from the Republic of South Sudan and current chair of the Khartoum process. As rightly mentioned, we have just come from Addis, where we conducted a thematic meeting on climate change, addressing impacts and adaptation strategies for human mobility in the context of climate change. First of all, I would like to thank Gaia Vince for your bold statements. And I've taken home one of your powerful statements, adapt to the shrinking spaces. That was a very strong message. I will come closer to you in a sense that I just want to give a picture of the environmental effects of climate change from the African continent. Of course, but before I say this, in our quest to address root causes of migration, identify them, address them, Khartoum process is very much resolved to try and do something about all of this. In this regard, we always say migration is unhuman, ancient, global phenomena that we cannot claim to eradicate or even stop. But we can definitely change it from irregular migration into safe, orderly, and regular migration. However, the bulk of migration, as all of you are aware, is within the African continent. For instance, the Republic of South Sudan is the greatest contributor to migration from different angles, from different reasons. Migration from its four contexts, that is refugees, internally displaced, labor migrants, and diaspora. Of course, talking about the root causes of migration, political instability, intercommunal violence, and you name it, but recently the climate change. You mentioned that soon maybe the world may see 1 million IDPs or migrants as the result of climate change. I want to bring, I don't know whether should I say good news to you. There is already 1 million displaced in the Republic of South Sudan as the result of flooding. Add to this, the Horn of Africa drought, that is in Kenya, in Somalia, and Ethiopia. There are already millions on a move.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We're going to let Gaia perhaps pick up those final points, and then we will need to wrap up the session.
Can I just drop one thing?
One more thing, please.
I think it is our moral responsibility to look into the causes of this. I think it should be a moral obligation for the developed world, not only to transit from fossil fuels, but to help the developing world to transit together into alternative clean energy and non-fossil fuels. When coronavirus hit, no doubt we are all together in this. So please take note of the African saying that the Ubuntu, I am because we are. Please, please, the whole world is at risk. It is our responsibility not to take care of it partially. Let us do it all together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And not only that, let us do it all together. We cannot do it unless we do it all together. This is a systemic problem. It is a planetary problem, and you're absolutely right. There is also, of course, a huge moral component to this, in that the more habitable places on the planet happen to be the Western rich industrialized nations who have largely created these safer societies through the combustion of fossil fuels, which is causing this problem, and the most impacted are in the global south. So there is a huge moral component to this as well. But it's absolutely right. This is already happening. We have fire, flood, drought and heat already driving people from their homes all over the global south, especially in the tropics. They will need to move. We can make this work. There's so many options. I do detail them, everything from looking at quota systems to setting up true labour mobility structures. But I know that we're running out of time. Thanks for your engagement in this issue. Please have it playing in your head exactly the scale, the unprecedented scale of what we face, and try and think outside of the current structures that we have about dealing with small numbers of people coming.
Thank you very much, Gaia, for your keen insight. Thank you, everyone, for the constructive discussion. That brings us to the end of the discussion, and I take that the window of action is still open. So,
of course, yeah, of course it is.
Three takeaways, please, for the session. First, let's anticipate that in the next decades, there will be people from climate vulnerable countries that will have to migrate to countries that are less vulnerable to climate change. So we need to plan ahead about that. Then we need also to consider those communities as people with rights, with agency and capacity. They are not a burden on society. And then we need a fundamental shift, if I understood well, from a humanitarian approach to an economic approach and long-term development.
Yeah.
So,
migration is an economic issue and a humanitarian issue. It's not a security issue. We need to move beyond that. People are people. They're your future neighbours and colleagues.
Thank you once again, Gaia.
Thanks, Honorary.